Thank you very much for your patience. I'd like to introduce now Jane Eisner. Jane Eisner, a pioneer in journalism, became editor-in-chief of The Forward in 2008, the first woman to hold the position at the influential Jewish national news organization. Under her leadership, the Forward readership has grown significantly, and it has won numerous regional and national awards for its original journalism in print and online. Jane's editorials have also won national and regional awards. Before joining The Forward, Jane held executive editorial and news positions at the Philadelphia Inquirer for 25 years. In addition, Jane Eisner also has deep roots in academia, serving as the first Koppel Fellow in Journalism at Wesleyan University and as a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Robert A. Fox Leadership Program. She was also one of 3 women chosen to be the first fellows of the new Catherine Houghton Hepburn Center at Bryn Mawr College. Her book, Taking Back the Vote, Getting American Youth Involved in Our Democracy, was published by Beacon Press in 2004. In addition, Jane Eisner has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsday, Brookings Review, Columbia Journalism Review, Ma'ayan, and The Reconstructionist, and served as a regular panelist on the WPVI television talk show Inside Story. We're so thrilled to have you here with us, especially after your long day of travel. The crowd is thrilled that you're here. Please give Jane Eisner a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all. I want to make sure you can hear me, yes? Wonderful. I really am very grateful to the Siegel Center and to Case Western University for inviting me for these few days. And I just want to pay special tribute to Alana Cooper and Cheryl Hirsch, who were fantastic in actually getting me here. So I'm going to talk to you some this evening about Jewish media, about the history of the Forward and Jewish journalism in the United States, and some of my ideas for what I do. And then I'm happy in the question and answer period to talk with you about anything else that's on your mind. I want to bring us back to May 2010. The Forward published a special 12-page section celebrating the life and work of Abraham Cahan, Ab Cahan, our founding editor and a giant in American Jewish journalism. It was on what would have been his 150th birthday. Cahan died in 1951, but his face and presence are everywhere in our newsroom, staring down at me on the walls of my office, his eyes stern, his mustache just so. And when you read that section, you will understand why it seems that he's actually never left us. Cahan ran the Yiddish Forward for half a century, turning it into what was the largest and arguably the most important Yiddish newspaper in history. In its heyday, the Forwards had more readers than any other non-English newspaper in America, an achievement that has never been surpassed. I wrote a piece then asking, what would Ab Cahan do in journalism today? What would he do when the business model that served him so well for so long has been completely upended, when readership is fragmented, attention spans have shrunk, and anyone with a blog address and an opinion can call himself a journalist? How would he cover a Jewish community that is so prosperous and powerful and yet so polarized and disparate, speaking many different languages, not just the Yiddish of his readers? What would Ab do? That question has haunted me ever since I became editor of The Forward 6.5 years ago. Cahan contributed mightily to the evolution of American journalism in the 20th century, Jewish and secular, and I would give anything to ask him for advice about the challenges that I face today. But I can't, and I won't turn this lecture hall into a seance, nor will I pretend that I can channel Cahan's personality, which was known to be Well, difficult. As Irving Howe noted in his authoritative 1976 History of Immigrant Jewry, The World of Our Fathers, Cahan was, quote, irritable and cranky, inordinately vain, and seldom at ease, unquote. I'm actually not sure that this type of person in public would work, on a podcast today. But this evening, I will try to put some of our current challenges in brief historical context and then offer you some perspectives on where Jewish media, Jewish journalism in particular, is going, and why, even at this moment of rapid change, I think the past has so much to teach us. First, some definitions. Media, in our vernacular, has come to mean a very broad array of communications. Journalism, in my opinion, is a much more precise craft. Long ago, I made up my own elevator speech about what I believed a good newspaper should do: inform, reflect, crusade, connect. I believe that just as strongly today that a good journalistic organization demands all of these characteristics. It's not enough simply to opine. We need to inform our readers and listeners, reflect upon their lives, champion their causes, and connect them to each other and to the broader community. Journalism, at first through newspapers and radio and television, and now through the internet, has always been a public trust in America, protected by the First Amendment and the unwritten rules of our profession. Unlike random bloggers and videographers, we have an address. You know where you can direct your complaint, your praise, or sometimes, thankfully, rarely as it happens, your lawsuit. We have a responsibility to verify information before it is published and to try to the best of our abilities to ensure that what we publish is true and fair. I remember when our youngest daughter called late one night to tell us excitingly that Osama bin Laden had been captured and killed. She said the news was all over Facebook, many long minutes before it was reported in the mainstream media. Well, that's nice, but Facebook and its gazillion friends didn't need to get the facts, didn't need to verify information. Journalists do. When it comes to Jewish journalism, I'm reminded of something that Steve Obinowitz, a communications consultant in Washington, often says about the Jewish vote. Jews are like all other Americans, and then so. Jewish journalism is like American journalism, only more so. We have all the challenges facing the industry as a whole, with the additional challenge of defining and reaching a broad, diverse, and sometimes undefinable audience. Our community's involvement with the press dates back to revolutionary times, when you could find ads for Jewish concerns or letters written by Jews in papers from Rhode Island to South Carolina. The first Jewish periodical was begun in 1823, when there were barely 3,000 Jews in the country. But the real beginning of the Jewish press occurred in Philadelphia in 1843, when the Chazan of Mikveh Israel Synagogue, a man named Isaac Leeser, founded a monthly journal called The Occident and American Jewish Advocate. As Kenneth Lebo writes in his essay on the history of American Jewish journalism, Leeser's publication appeared when the Jewish population was growing rapidly. Between 1850 and 1860, just in one decade, the number grew from 50,000 to 150,000, tripled in size. Here's what Lebo wrote. With neither a native-born rabbinate nor national organizations of any significance to turn to for guidance, Jews looked to Leeser's Occident and subsequent Jewish journals for answers to questions regarding Jewish behavior and identity in the New World, both in relation to other Jews and to a broader society of fellow Americans. Repeatedly on the page of the Occident, Lisa insisted that America was not a Christian nation in which Jews were tolerated as a minority, but rather that Jews were entitled to the same rights as other religious groups. This role of writing for the community while championing its rights in the broader American society is one that you'll see repeated again and again. The years following the Civil War saw a dramatic increase in the Jewish population in major cities and the rise of regional presses. Isaac Mayer Wives' Israelite in nearby Cincinnati, the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia, newspapers in Boston, New York, Baltimore, Rochester, Chicago, St. Louis, New York, Memphis, New Orleans, San Francisco, and even more. There were specialty journals for housewives, for farmers, and for children. And then there was the Yiddish press. The secular Yiddish press came into its own in the 1880s and 1890s with the influx of Eastern European Jews to America's cities and towns. Cahan became the first editor of the Forwards in 1897. We're about to celebrate our 118th anniversary on April 22nd. He began in 1897. He left for a couple of years, went to work for the secular press, and then was lured back and stayed for half a century, leading a newspaper that in its heyday sold 250,000 copies every day, coast to coast, and probably had, considering this was an immigrant community that passed around the papers, probably had about 750,000 readers every day. The Forward was launched at a singular moment of high-impact journalism. As the historian Moses Rishin writes, "In no time or place did newspaper reporters play so salient and so dramatic a role in shaping the popular mind as they did in New York between 1897 and 1902, when Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst drove the new journalism to unprecedented heights of influence, virtuosity, and extravagance." Cahan's Forward was an enviable mix of what today we might call highbrow and pedestrian, strewn with sensational stories of gambling, prostitution, scandal, all manners of misdeeds on the Lower East Side and elsewhere, along with thundering editorials and erudite essays, and the original writing of such literary titans as Isaac Bashevis Singer and Elie Wiesel. Not to mention publication of masterpieces such as Madame Bovary that were translated into Yiddish and published week after week serially to expose immigrant readers to the classics. Cahan's newspaper, Libo observed, served as a university in print. I just love that phrase, a university in print. Its politics were social democratic, aligned closely with labor, disdainful of communism, and absolutely in love with America. Cahan was intent on using the pages of the Forward to help his immigrant readers become Americans. His vehicle was the Bintel Brief. Many of you are nodding your heads. I know you've heard of it. The Bintel Brief, the bundle of letters, launched on January 20th, 1906, an advice column that helped perplexed readers navigate the shoals of American life. There, Cahan explained the rules of baseball and how to use a thermometer. There was advice on how to can peaches and use a handkerchief and employ good manners on the street. Cahan essentially replaced the shtetl rabbi as the immigrant's moral guide. I have to read you one of my favorites. "I am a young man of 25 and I recently met a fine girl. She has a flaw, however, a dimple in her chin. It is said that people who have this lose their first husband or wife. I love her very much, but I'm afraid to marry her, lest I die because of the dimple. And here was Cahan's answer. The tragedy is not that the girl has a dimple in her chin, but that some people have a screw loose in their head. Cahan had an extraordinary sense of who his readers were. As Lawrence Epstein writes, the Forward also served as a crucial psychological role for the workers who read it. Their dire lives were marked by struggle and frequently by self-doubt and concerns that their families and neighbors now saw them as failures. The Forward gave them pride in themselves. They were, in its pages, struggling as a community. Theirs was not a lonely crowd. A powerful illustration of this connection came on March 25th, 1911, when the Triangle Shirtwaist factory on Washington Place in Lower Manhattan burst into flames. 146 workers, most of them Jewish and Italian immigrant women and girls, were trapped behind locked doors on the top floors of the 10-story building, too tall for the city's fire trucks to reach. Some jumped to their deaths in scenes eerily repeated a century later at Ground Zero. The morgue is full of our victims, read the headline in the next day's Forward. Now, just notice the language here for a moment. Our victims. There was no distance between Cahan and his readers then. There was no attempt to present journalism with a dispassionate eye. This was real, direct, visceral identification. Indeed, when people heard about the fire, they rushed into the Forward newsroom on 175 East Broadway to learn more. They knew where to go. And in his editorials, Cahan did not hold back. The entire neighborhood is sitting Shiva, he wrote 2 days later. Every heart is torn to mourning. The human heart is drowning in tears. What a catastrophe. What a dark misfortune. But Cahan forcefully dismissed the notion that this was a natural disaster that could have been prevented. And here's something else he wrote. Is it natural that hundreds of youth should be in prison in a 10-story fire trap? Is it natural for so many people to be crowded in together and for there not to have enough emergency exits? Is it natural for such a fire trap of a building to have locked doors? And then he wrote, there should be no doubt that the capitalist leaders are generally guilty for this, who do all in their power to extract as much profit as possible from their capital, even if it costs thousands of lives. On the altar of capitalism, that bloodthirsty idol, which is never quenched with human blood, burned these hundreds of lives. There was no question where Ab Cahan stood. But then World War II changed everything. The sharp decline in Jews who spoke and read Yiddish, secular Jews, led the Forward to eventually become a weekly paper that continues today as a bi-weekly paper with a very small but devoted audience. Regional Jewish newspapers became owned or subsidized by the local federations or philanthropic individuals, maintaining their roles as dispensers of community news, but not with the independence of a true free press. At the same time, Jews became leaders in the mainstream press. Adolf Ochs turned the New York Times into the finest newspaper in America and perhaps the world. Eugene Myers transformed the Washington Post from a disregarded rag in the nation's capital to its most eminent newspaper. Joseph Pulitzer created the journalism school at Columbia University, of which I am a proud graduate. and the Annenberg family bought the Philadelphia Inquirer and laid the groundwork for it to become a newspaper of great repute. No longer needing to practice journalism outside the mainstream, Jews were the mainstream, although some of those Jews were not necessarily eager to acknowledge their identification. As Deborah Lipstadt demonstrates in her powerful book, Beyond Belief, the American press, led by the New York Times, failed to treat the destruction of European Jews as urgent news, or really news at all, from 1933 to 1945. The Jews holding the power of the press in their hands did not necessarily use it to write about and publicize the biggest Jewish story of the 20th century before the foundation of the State of Israel. True also, Abe Rosenthal had to hide his Jewishness behind his initials. He was officially known as A.M. Rosenthal when he became a reporter for the New York Times. Although afterwards I started to think to myself, Rosenthal's kind of a Jewish name, but anyhow. Somehow or another, he felt obliged to do that. But when he became executive editor of the New York Times, he inaugurated an era of accomplishment for Jews on that staff. Max Frankel, immigrant from Germany, succeeded him. Joseph Lelyfeld, son of a rabbi, succeeded him. For a time, people in the Times newsroom wondered if there would ever be a non-Jewish executive editor. There is. Today, Jews are accepted major players in all aspects of journalism. Personally, I have never had a problem melding my Jewish self with my work during decades in mainstream media. And there were moments when my work allowed me to be an eyewitness to my own history. My most memorable experience during 25 years at the Philadelphia Inquirer was standing on that very cold Berlin Bridge in February of 1986 to see the man, then known as Anatoly Sharansky, zigzag his way to freedom. But as is true in so many realms in America, this acceptance in wider society has diluted the need to maintain purely Jewish journalism and placed serious stress on its future. It's the classic dynamic of the universal versus the particular. In some communities, New York especially, Jewish stories are, well, stories. Israel news is for everyone. Why maintain a specialized Jewish journalism? And if it's necessary, how should it be supported and funded? How can it be as essential to American Jews in the 21st century as the Forward was a century earlier? Alone, really, among American Jewish media organizations, we at the Forward see our role as being a watchdog for our community. We prize our independence, and we employ it to hold our leaders accountable. So, for example, we publish the salaries of the leaders of the 75 largest Jewish communal organizations in the country every year, and we analyze those salaries. And we note, sadly, how few of them are women, a number that, unfortunately, has remained stubbornly low, and I'm going to have the chance to talk about that tomorrow. We write about the cover-up of child sexual abuse among some in the Haredi community, and the terrible treatment of animals and workers in the kosher meat industry, and the plight of the Jewish middle class in today's unforgiving economy. Sadly, most Jewish news organizations are not equipped to do this kind of labor-intensive, high-stakes, at times risky journalism. Either they don't have the budget, or they don't have the talent, or they don't have the independence to take on the powers that be. Most Jewish news organizations in this country, including most of the new web-only startups, are either partially or entirely funded by their local federations, or they're supported by a philanthropist with a particular point of view. The Forward can only maintain its independence because of its investments and savings left to us by all those old socialists who, it turns out, were damn good businessmen. But we can't rely on that forever, which is why, in addition to trying to grow our revenue from circulation and advertising, we are now a 501c3 nonprofit and actively solicit donations to ensure our future. We struggle with the gigantic economic challenges facing everyone in journalism today, but as I mentioned earlier, since we are Jews, only more so. The industry's business model has been upended, with readers abandoning print for online and mobile devices, and with many advertisers doing the same. The problem, of course, is that virtually no one in my industry has figured out how to make money online. A few name brands, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, they put up a paywall on their websites and charge for usage through one method or another. But that is a very difficult proposition for most of us. Other sites use their enormous traffic to economic advantage. But the Forward is never going to be Politico or Huffington Post or BuzzFeed. Jews are just too small a sliver of the American population to expect that level of readership and, frankly, that volume of news. But I don't bemoan this wave towards digital journalism, not at all. I embrace it, and not just because I have to, not just because I have to. I truly believe that it enables us to do better journalism by using images, still and moving, to tell more compelling stories, by using the tools of social media to engage our readers and solicit their input, whether it's to find the best challah recipe or identify Jews for our annual Forward 50 list, or this week we're publishing our third annual list of America's most inspiring rabbis nominations. All of them came from our readers, hundreds and hundreds of nominations. And we can reach a much broader audience than ever before. Just think about it now. When Cahan published in Yiddish, only those who could read and understand Yiddish could access its content, and it's at a pretty high level of Yiddish. When the English Forward was launched in 1990, only those who saw the printed newspaper could access its content. And that meant essentially that the vast majority of our readers were Jewish, and pretty Jewy Jews at that. Now, we have many, many more readers online than in print, more than 2 million page views a month and growing. Our content is linked to on everything from well-known news sites to food blogs. We are part of the mainstream conversation, and we want to be even more so. This evolution mirrors the evolution of Jews in America, who have moved from an insular and defined community to one that carefully assimilated into the mainstream society, to one that now, in many ways, pulls the levers of power everywhere, from the White House to Silicon Valley to the Ivy League. But with this broader palette, with this broader audience, comes real responsibility. Cahan's thundering editorials were read by people who knew him, people who understood his language and his references, who appreciated that he was talking within the family. My editorials can be read by anyone in the world. It's a kind of heady feeling, and it's a little frightening. If I criticize the Israeli government, will those words be used against her by her enemies? If I refrain from such criticism, am I stifling the very act of dissent so valued in our tradition? And who are our readers anyhow? In Cahan's day, he could leave the office on East Broadway, walk through the streets of the Lower East Side, hang out in a barbershop or at the Garden Cafe on the corner of East Broadway, and he could listen and learn Apparently, he did that often, which is why his newspaper so accurately reflected his community and why for so many decades it bounded together through the written word. The Jewish community today is diverse, spread out, difficult to characterize, and impossible to control. When we journalists say we are speaking for our community, what does that mean? Am I speaking for the highly educated and involved Jews in my Upper West Side neighborhood in Manhattan? Am I speaking for the old me, the suburban mom in Philadelphia? Or are you hundreds of miles away? The Jews in Atlanta or Altoona? My kids in Brooklyn? Just as scholars, communal leaders, rabbis, philanthropists, and politicians have trouble defining who is a Jew, so do journalists. Identifying an audience and connecting with it was one of the central attributes of success in the old days of hot type, and it remains so in the new confusing era of cyberjournalism. I go back to my earlier definition of the mission of a news organization: inform, reflect, crusade, connect. We know how to inform and reflect. Those of us with the will and resources can investigate and campaign and perform the watchdog function of classic journalism. We know how to do that. But the more difficult challenge of the 21st century is to connect in meaningful ways, to create a community in cyberspace as essential to its members as the old Forwards newsroom was essential in its time. The historian Jenna Weissman-Joslett, who is also a Forward columnist, once wrote that Abraham Cahan spent 51 years explaining America to its newest Americans. I love that phrase, explaining America to its newest Americans. The Jewish media today doesn't need to explain America to its readers anymore. Instead, in my belief, we need to use every tool at our disposal to tell the kind of compelling stories that bind Jews one to another in this promised and challenging land. Thank you all.
Okay, we're happy to take questions.
Sure.
Hi, I'd like to know, you are held to the truth and so forth by laws and things, but how do you go against those that are not held to what they say, the lies that they may come up with?
We try to the best of our ability to verify information and to challenge. So there's a couple of ways in which we do that. For one thing is we try not to publish things that we know are incorrect. So not only is that a standard for those of us on the payroll, I write all the editorials and sometimes some longer essays as well, so I'm held to that standard too. But for example, just today, we were discussing something that someone had submitted for a letter to the editor. And we wanted to make sure, to the best of our ability, that the information that was in that letter was correct. The opinion was the letter writer's. Dramatically disagrees with me, that's okay, that's the point. But we don't want to knowingly publish incorrect information. Now, sometimes public officials, leaders, charity leaders, ordinary people will tell you things that aren't correct. You know, you've been in this business for 30 years, as I have, you can sort of, sometimes you develop a kind of skeptical sense, and you're thinking, wait, that doesn't sound very true. And so we try to check it out as much as we can. Legally, as long as we try very hard and are not intentionally libeling a public figure, a private person, a public figure has a much higher bar to sue on. that is legally correct, but we want to be much more than legally correct. I don't want to make a career on just not getting sued too much. What I really want to do is make sure that, again, to the best of our abilities, we're only human, we're imperfect. Journalism is not the best you can do. Journalism is the best you can do in the time that you have. And that time, especially for a news organization like us, which runs a website 24/7, that time is sometimes short, but we really do hold ourselves to that standard.
Can you explain how one can access the Forward? How do you get it online? How do you get it subscribed to, and so on?
Well, thank you, sir. This was not a planted question. So the best thing to do is to subscribe. We have about 30,000 subscribers. The newspaper comes once a week. If you subscribe soon, you will be in for a treat because we are redesigning both our print and internet product to coincide with our anniversary on April 22nd. And it's going to be gorgeous, a real keeper. We reserve our best stories for the print edition and use a lot of beautiful photographs and designs. It's really meant to be sort of like a luxury item, something that you want to keep on the table. If you're Shomer Shabbat, you'll read it on Shabbat, or bring it with you on the train, or just share it amongst your friends. The subscriptions are not very expensive, and I was a subscriber for years and years and years, really since the English Forward began. A friend of mine had heard that it was beginning, got us a gift subscription, and my husband and I kept the subscription for many years before I ended up working for the Forward. In fact, when I got my job, I went back to that friend who got us the original subscription and said, "It's all your fault. I'm leaving Philly." You can also happily sign up online. It's free. You just go to forward.com, and when you go to the website, at the very top of the website, there's a place where you can put in your email address. Only you can do it. I can't do it for you. We don't sign up people without their permission. And when you do that, you can sign up for our daily newsletters, which come at around 8 o'clock on Monday through Friday, and then around 10 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday, because I really can't make the person who's in charge wake up so early on the weekend. And then we also have specialty newsletters. We have a food one, we have arts and culture, we have Sisterhood, which is our women's issue blog. And then when big things happen, like, let's say an Israeli election, we put out a special edition. So for example, today we had a special edition newsletter just about the Israeli elections. And all of them are free. We try not to bombard you. When I say a newsletter, it's a little bit of a misleading term. It's really like a mini front page. We generally have 3, sometimes 4 stories highlighted, that's all. I don't want to overwhelm you. Always something from news, something from arts, something from opinion. And then we have many blogs, and we'll feature a blog post on it. So we spend a lot of time crafting that newsletter. I approve it every night before I go to bed. We want the words to be precise, and we want them to be alluring. We want you to click on and read. We have over 60,000 subscribers to our newsletter, and we know that they're very happy with it because many of them click through to the stories. So those are the 2 ways that you can read our content. As I mentioned, we are a nonprofit, and you can also support us in many ways as well.
Are the comments after the stories actively moderated by a human being?
They are moderated by a human being. Actively would imply that that human being is moderating those contents all the time, and that's not, I can't promise that. I just don't have the staff for it. I do have someone who, part of her job is to moderate the the comments, and the managing editor also has the right and the responsibility to monitor, to delete comments that are inappropriate, and occasionally, frankly, to bar an inappropriate commenter from continuing to do so. In the new website, in our new design, there'll be both increased scrutiny of comments, but also increased ability to comment. It's a subject that is being really, really debated in journalism. There are some websites that are reducing comments dramatically. There's one website that's paying for the privilege of making comments, which I find really odd. It's one of our Jewish competitors, so I'll be nice and not mention the name. You know, and we've debated a lot about this. And look, I got to tell you, sometimes, especially given the kind of editorials I write, you know, you read the comments and you just, oh my gosh, who are these people? They're not very enlightening or ennobling. But you know, we really depend on interaction with our readers. And I think it's haughty. It's kind of, you know, it is not right for us to cut them out or to put up barriers that are impossibly high for people. And the truth is, sometimes we get really good comments. Sometimes people will come in and say, hey, you got this fact wrong, and then we'll go and change it. Sometimes people recommend good story ideas or engage with each other, you know. And so we feel committed to keeping that going, but we want it to be to the best of our ability, not a toxic environment, but rather an inviting environment for people to engage. It's a good question.
Could you tell us a little bit over here?
Oh, hi.
Welcome, thanks for making it. About the demographics of both your readers and your reporters, and is it a cause for concern going forward?
Wow. Well, I'll start with my reporters. I don't have a big staff, but I think person for person, I have the most wonderful staff of anybody. I mean, I ran departments at the Philadelphia Inquirer that were bigger than my staff is now, but I think in terms of the quality, they're just unmatched. I have reporters in New York. I have one reporter, Natan Gutman, who's actually Israeli but is based in Washington. And then since last summer, we've had a full-time reporter in Israel, Naomi Zeveloff. We use a great deal of freelance work, especially for our culture section and our opinion section. We have people who write for us regularly in opinion and in culture. Jay Michelson, Alyssa Strauss, I mentioned Jenna Weissman-Joslett. Demographically, I would say just about everyone on my staff, save maybe 2 people, are younger than I am. They come from very diverse backgrounds. Not everyone is Jewish. I feel that there are some positions that really sort of demand Jewish knowledge of the kind that you can only get if you're Jewish. So the news editor, the culture editor, the opinion editor. But for a long time, the managing editor, my first managing editor, was not Jewish. That was not a job that I felt really demanded it, and this person had so many other qualities that, I was given permission to hire her, and she was awesome and stayed with us for as long as she could stay in New York, and then she also was from Philly and then had to return. Current managing editor is Jewish. But there are others that aren't. The head of our digital media team isn't Jewish, the head of our design department. So there's a real mixture. Some people have come from elsewhere in Jewish journalism. Others, like myself, came from the secular press. We have different levels of observance, different nationalities. I've got I've got 2 Brits, I've got a whole lot of people from Canada. I've got somebody from Poland, somebody from Austria. I mean, it's really interesting, just this mix of people in a small newsroom. It's very exciting. It means like really fun conversations and occasionally good stuff to eat. We just hired a new illustrator and member of our design team, Anya Ulanich. I don't know if anyone has heard of her. She is awesome. She's an amazing writer. She published also a graphic novel last year that was named to the New York Times 100 Most Notable list. And she works for me now. She does amazing illustrations and some writing. She's from Russia and emigrated here. So we come from a really diverse background that I think mirrors the diversity of the Jewish people. Frankly, I think the fact that we have so many non-Americans is because there really isn't any other place to work like this in their home countries. Many of our non-Americans come to the States for graduate school and then try to stay. Legally, of course. So it's a really terrific staff. Now, our readers. Our print readers skew older, about my age and older. That's normal. They tend to be very, very dispersed nationally. Most live outside the New York metropolitan area. So while we are based in New York, and I subscribe to the Saul Steinberg view of New York. It is the center of the universe. But the truth is that most of our readers, 60% probably, live outside New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. So we feel very committed to covering all of American Jewry. We are about 2/3 done through a wonderful project that we're doing called Our Promised Lands, where we run a big feature story or essay from a different state every week. We've just done practically every state, and we will finish it by July 4th. We started it last July 4th. So we're very committed to doing that. Our digital readership, we know it skews younger, but honestly, I don't have good demographics on that. It's been growing so much that we haven't really done any good market research on that.
I'm just going to jump in as a little bit of a follow-up. I'm wondering if you can say something about where you think the future of print media is, what it will look like in 5 years, 10 years from now.
Wow. Well, I have been thinking about this a lot. The redesign that I mentioned that we are about to launch in a month's time is not just cosmetic. It's not just, oh, we want a new color and some different typeface. It's actually the result of a year and a half of tremendous amount of study with outside consultants, trying to think about who our audience is now and how we can grow that audience. And through that process, we also went through the hard task of deciding, do we want to be in print? If so, how? How frequently? What should it look like? Why would someone buy it? And the fact that we are redesigning the print product indicates that we do believe that we have a future. Certainly for the foreseeable future. I don't know that there's anybody around who would predict what journalism is going to look like 10 years from now. But I can tell you that for the next 3 to 5 years, we are very committed to print. We think our readers care about having that kind of product, that if it's well put together, if it's got compelling stories presented in a beautiful design, something that can be savored, something that can be taken anywhere, something that you don't need to plug in, that we think they'd be willing to spend, $70, $80 a year on the privilege of getting this delivered to your home every week. So we do believe that there is a future in print. It helps to pay the bills, honestly, but we also know that we have to have a dynamic presence online to attract younger readers and also to be part of the American conversation.
This side. I think it's miraculous that the forwards continues as the forward. Really a miracle. But I have to ask you, as the father-in-law of a journalist in Jersey City who's returning to the field after maternal care, are there any openings?
At this very moment, no, but I'll be honest with you, and don't repeat this back in New York, but I live in fear that, the next time I'm in the office, one of our young, absolutely awesome reporters are going to walk in, close the door, and tell me that, they just got a job at the New York Times. So the truth is, it's really important in journalism to cultivate contacts and to create relationships and to keep up with people. I have 3 daughters. My youngest one is a journalist. And it's, I'm very proud of her. It's really exciting. It scares scares me, partly because I don't know what the profession's going to be like, partly because she wants to be a foreign correspondent in some very dangerous areas. So whatever, we'll see how that works out. But, I try to counsel her. Never burn a bridge. Show people who you've worked for what your work is like. Keep up with them. Develop these kinds of relationships, so that when an opening does happen, that person might be first in line. So she should be reading. Here's what you should tell her. Read our stuff. Read it online if she doesn't want to buy a subscription, to really familiarize herself with it. And if she thinks that that's a place that, that would fit her skills and her talents and her passion, she should get in touch with me, and certainly we can start a conversation.
To build a younger generation of interest in the Forward. When I went to school, we had the weekly reader, okay? And of course, if you were to publish something that went to the Jewish day schools, you would start a foundation that would build an interest in the Jewish community at large, not just the community that they live in. And the other, that came about because of somebody else's question. But the other thing that I was thinking about is that an emotional response from an editorial is what creates greater interest, wider interest. You didn't speak about that. You talked about reflection. Reflection is not an emotional response. An emotional response is I read something like from Ben Cohn's articles in the Jewish News here in Cleveland, and I have a discussion either with one of my kids or one of my friends, because I have an emotional response. Either I agree with them or I don't. And I think that that's what creates interest. And then you also said something about you want to connect the Jewish people with the Jewish people. But I think you want to connect the Jewish people with Americans.
Well, you're a really smart guy. Seriously, the role of emotion is so important. I agree with you. I don't think it only comes from editorials. If my staff were here, they would affirm this. I talk a lot about emotion. I think that we need to look for the emotional component in stories, not the sensational component, not to be teary or superficial, but really to get at the emotional story. And we're trying much, much harder to do that. In the last little more than a year, we really started this kind of only at the end of 2013, but in 2014, we ran a number of very long pieces that were propelled by personal journeys. So Josh Nathan Kazes, who's of Sephardic ancestry, went back to Spain and Portugal to sort of investigate his Sephardic past because the Spanish were saying anyhow that they were welcoming Jews. And he wrote a fantastic 2-part series on that. Paul Berger, who's grew up in England, spent a lot of time in Russia, speaks Russian, had lived with a family in Novgorod, and never told them that he was Jewish. And he went back to that family to tell them he was Jewish. Very emotional piece. I spent a week in November on a reporting trip in Poland with a group that was trying to bring about reconciliation between Polish Jews and Christians, well, the rest of Poles. And that turned into an extremely emotional story for me as well. So you're absolutely right. We do try to look at that very, very carefully. I think other people want to talk, so just quickly. Yeah. Honestly, Josh's story was so much better. You should read it online. Longer. It's long. It'll take you an hour to finish it probably, but it was amazing. Just amazing.
Are you going to take any other questions?
Sure. Sure. Happy to take some more questions.
Oh, good. First of all, thank you. It's most enjoyable. But I'd like to focus on a couple of things. One, you used the term risky. Risky journalism. I didn't understand the term, and it implied that you've been sued recently. That may not be the right conclusion. So that was question number one. or maybe 1.5. The other thing that I wanted to ask about is what happened to Yiddish in this country and Yiddish publications? If you know, share that with us. And the third might be, if you have time, what did you think of the Israeli election and what was in the press today?
Wow. Okay. So I'll try for the first two, and then we'll see if we have time for the second, because if there are other people who have questions, I want to answer them as well. So risky. What do I mean by risky? Well, yes. I mean, I have had chance to employ lawyers. Depending on what we're writing about, we have a joke about our lawyer, our libel lawyer, that every time we do one of these really big investigations, thanks to the Forward, he's putting a deck on his beach house, depending on what we're paying for him. But now, the truth is that we do risky investigations. I referenced a few in my talk. A few years back, we were really the main news organization that illuminated abuses of humans and animals in Postville, Iowa, at the nation's largest plant for producing kosher meat. It resulted in the largest immigration raid of the U.S. government, and the person who ran that plant is still in jail. That was risky. There are still people who think that we were, gunning for that family because it was a very big Lubavitch family that ran it, and we weren't. We just cared a whole lot about how immigrant workers were being treated and how animals were being treated. That largely, though not completely, happened before I got to the Forward. On my watch, we've had a number of very serious investigations. I think the one that, in a sense, I don't want to say I'm proud of this because it was so upsetting, but we were the news organization that uncovered a pattern of sexual abuse at Yeshiva University High School, predominantly committed by 3 people in the dorms that affected probably at least 24 men. And we wrote about this. It was very risky on so many levels. It wasn't just, we're afraid that YU is going to sue us. They never did. They didn't have a case. But also, you take an enormous emotional responsibility by airing these. I mean, we named names, and I wanted to be damn sure that I wasn't ruining somebody's reputation. These were esteemed rabbis who we were accusing of abusing boys. And we also had a responsibility to the victims, to the alleged victims, to tell their stories, to hide their identities if they wanted it to be hid. So this is very, very risky. And we take it really seriously. And once you publish something, it's out there. And believe me, I'm very well aware of the Jewish ethics of speech. They don't perfectly align with journalistic standards, but they certainly inform ours. Yiddish. So our Yiddish Forward is published every other week in print. It's also online Monday through Friday. It has a separate staff, a small but devoted audience. The truth is that the number of adults who read a secular Yiddish newspaper like the Forwards are declining rapidly. I mean, they're very devoted, really, until they die, and then not so much. But yeah, there is a younger group of people who are studying Yiddish. They're never going to be a huge number, but clearly we think that's our future, to attract them to our site. I think about my best friend in Philly whose son studied Yiddish at Harvard. That's who's going to be doing that. Now, I should say, though, that there are Yiddish newspapers with gigantic circulation and thick amounts of advertising, but they're the Haredi newspapers. So, they don't want to know a thing about the Forward. They certainly wouldn't publish my picture. And we suspect that there are a growing number of Haredi readers who surreptitiously read the forward in Yiddish, but we can't prove that. And we are trying to court them as well. So it's small, but it's dedicated. Oh.
We'll take your question in a moment. I just want to ask my own question. This might be more appropriate for tomorrow's talk, but I was hoping that you would be able to talk for a moment about your experience as a woman in a high-powered position, running a Jewish business organization, and how that plays out.
Wow. Yes, that is a big subject. So I'll just try to touch upon a few things. First of all, I'm the first woman to be ahead of the Forward, English or Yiddish, and I think that the Forward Association, in choosing me, really did made a bold statement and has never ever wavered. I've never felt just a moment of uncomfortableness in this environment. And I've been around long enough to know what that feels like. And I, afterwards can share worse stories with you in other circumstances. So I do feel a tremendous commitment by the owners. We're a nonprofit, by the board of the association and my leadership. And I feel very, very responsible for encouraging younger women and have a staff with a lot of younger women on my staff. And for a while, the managing editor was also a woman. So the two top jobs were women. But in the Jewish world, it's still a real issue. And I'll just tell you briefly, how I came about to do this salary survey, and then we can talk more about it tomorrow. But when I got to the Forward in the summer of 2008, I'd been in Philadelphia at 25 years at the Philadelphia Inquirer and another 2.5 years at the National Constitution Center. I was very involved with a group of sort of the 50 most important women in Philadelphia. I was even president of the group for a while. So I was used to seeing women in important roles in nonprofit community. I mean, 2 Jewish women in a row running the University of Pennsylvania, the largest private employer in Philadelphia, the head of the Pew Foundation, at the time the head of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, et cetera, et cetera. I knew these women. They were judges and businesswomen and philanthropists. And then I come to New York, and my publisher takes me around to meet some of the important people, and they're all men. And I thought to myself, well, there's got to be some women. And literally, this is what I did. I would notice when we would run stories that would mention a woman who seemed interesting, I would write her a note and say, can we meet? And that's how, actually, I reached out and have now become really great colleagues with a number of these women because they're awesome. Nancy Kaufman, the head of the National Council of Jewish Women, Ruth Messenger, head of AJWS, Rabbi Joy Levitt, who runs the JCC Manhattan, the biggest JCC, I think, in the world. I don't know, but just, and on, and there really are some great women there. But the experience also made me curious as a journalist, was my experience of finding it so hard to locate these women leaders just anecdotal, or was there something else deeper? And that's how the salary survey that we have done now for every year since 2009 came about. I just want to say one thing too, that all my children are grown now, and so it's a lot easier to work the hours that I work. But I know what it's like to catch the train so that you can get home for the babysitter who's going to leave otherwise. And I know what it's like, when your kid is sick or your nanny has to leave in the middle of the day because her mother died. And I see that now repeated. In fact, my oldest daughter's married and has a son. I'm a proud Savta. And just today, in fact, it turns out he was sick and needed to stay home from daycare, and my husband took the afternoon off work and went to Brooklyn to go take care of him. My son-in-law took the morning off because my daughter really, really needed to be at work today. And so I see it now, these struggles repeated through my children. I believe that I'm very fortunate so far, anyhow, that they're nearby and that we can help out. And had I not been coming here, I would have done it as well. But because I see these struggles now repeated generation after generation, I firmly believe that it is not just up to strong individuals, strong women, and their great husbands. There has to be governmental and societal change to really make it so that working families can raise their children, hold jobs, contribute to society, and hopefully contribute to their communities.
Thank you. We'll take one more question.
Okay.
Thank you. So one of these issues you mentioned is the role of the paper is to advocate or champion.
Mm-hmm.
And as a person who's read the forwards online now and previously in print, I know that on certain issues you bring multiple sides to a story. You have in your opinion page different perspectives because the issue is controversial or because the issue has multiple sides. Other times you only have one position. At times, you obviously certain of your opinion writers write things from a certain perspective. How open are you to the variety of world, or is this an editorial decision that you're making, that you have a line you want, that you think is important for people to understand, to educate, or to advocate, et cetera? Where does that sit in your decision making?
That's a good question. So we'll start with the most direct way to answer, which is I write almost all of the editorials, except for the week or two I'm on vacation, and those are my opinions sanctioned by my publisher, and they're my opinions, and they're not everybody else's opinions as well. I, have a lot of experience writing editorials and running editorial boards. I was editorial page editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer for many years. I've won lots and lots of awards for my editorials, so I feel like my peers have recognized that. And I know that good editorials are the result of a lot of reporting, a lot of reading. You may not see people quoted a lot in my editorials, but believe me, I talk to a lot of people. I read a lot. I try to come up with what I think is a cogent argument that presents a point of view that is, in general, consistent with the Forward's history of progressive politics. But sometimes I diverge from those politics as well. So part of what I was hired to do was to be an editorial writer. So that's what I do. Now, our opinion pages, and not just in print but online, host a variety of opinion. So yesterday, for example, online, we had running commentary from J.J. Goldberg, who my predecessor, he's a senior editor and writes a weekly column and has a blog. And his opinions on the election were, I think, more analytical than partisan. But we certainly also run people who were upset about the turnout and the vote and how it was concluded. We also ran a terrific piece by David Hazony, who's a regular writer for us and whose politics are much more to the right than ours is, but just personal friend, great writer, great thinker, and very appropriate to have on our pages. So we really try to have a variety of opinions on our editorial pages, as we should. We are a nonprofit. We're not supposed to advocate for a particular candidate or a particular piece of legislation. We don't endorse candidates. Of course, I would never endorse in Israel because I'm not there, but we don't endorse here either, and because that's part of our responsibility. Now, I think that sometimes it's fair to ask whether opinion and perspective and approach also influences the news side, and I'm sure that it does. We try really hard to be accurate and to always ask for different points of view and to try to get the other side. But there's no doubt that we, I think, have an argument to be made. I don't think the argument is pro-APAC or pro-J Street. I don't think the argument is, pro or con Yeshiva University. I think the argument is that we're journalists. We're here to ferret out the truth as best as we can, and we have great faith in our readers. I think our readers are really smart, really discerning. I think they want the highest quality of reporting and writing and editing from us as we could possibly deliver. They certainly will tell us if they got something wrong, if we got something wrong. They'll certainly tell us if they don't agree. That's fine. That kind of give and take is part of the process. I feel no pressure to dumb it down. I feel no pressure to wave a certain banner in a certain way, not just because of the great leadership I have at the Forward, but because of you all, because you're really discerning readers. And my feeling about it is that if we're open, we'll sometimes run an essay on the front page. The old days, there was this distinction between news and opinion. That's gone now. Journalism is flat. Everything online is flat. Everything looks the same. A culture piece of, a piece from the food blog or my editorial, it all looks the same. But it needs to be labeled carefully. You deserve to know what that piece is. So if we're running an essay that has personal opinion in it, not on a crusade, but personal opinion, like, for example, the stories that I referenced that we did last year, we make it really clear to readers what this is about. And then I trust our readers to take it in the way that we offered it. And if they don't like it, let us know about that as well. So it's, I think what I try for the most is transparency, to make it clear what we're about, not to toe a particular point of view or a particular line, but to just be as honest and transparent as possible, trusting that our readers will accept that. Thank you.
Thank you. We have so many more questions, but we're going to end the evening. I want to remind you, if you're interested, we still have spots open for tomorrow afternoon, and you'll have more of a chance to talk and learn. Thank you.
Good. Thank you all.